A security guard humiliates a janitor, then Morgan Freeman intervenes and imparts a lesson to everyone. One of Manhattan's highest towers' lobby was alive with Monday morning hustle. Powerful leaders rushed in, their polished shoes clicking on the marble flooring. As workers hurried to their offices with briefcases in one hand and phones in the other, the smell of pricey cologne blended with the aroma of fresh coffee. Most people missed a janitor finishing his morning ritual at the far end of the lobby. Does one's value depend on their position and riches? Comment 1 for no, 0 for yes. For more than 10 years, Daniel, a 55-year-old maintenance worker, had been tending to this building. He made sure the floors gleamed, the trash cans were emptied, and everything was in perfect shape for those who never even looked his way every morning before the rush started. He never voiced discontent. He was rather proud of his work. Today, though, today would be different. A sharp voice sliced through the morning buzz as Daniel scrubbed a patch of the floor close to the door. "Hey, you missed a spot." Turning, Daniel did. Mark, the chief of security for the building, stood next to the security desk, a man who approached his work, perhaps somewhat too seriously. Daniel nodded and produced a courteous smile, with his mop ringing. "I'll get it in a second," he said. But Mark was not happy. He moved forward with crossed arms. "You know, people like you mess up the easiest jobs." Danny stopped. Though not this loudly, not this publicly, he had heard remarks like this before. A few workers close stopped mid-stride, acting not to hear, but their eyes turned toward the scene. Mark graced his smile. "You just mop floorings, man. How hard can it be? No wonder you're still stuck doing this after all these years." The words come across as a slap. Daniel tightened his jaw but did not respond. For what would be the point? People like Mark never saw people like him as equals. A slow, deliberate voice from across the lobby raised itself just then. "That's an interesting thing to say." The air in the room changed. Workers who had been about to enter the lift stopped mid-motion. Mark's arrogant manner also wavered as he turned to face the voice. And there, seated in a leather chair close to the window, was Morgan Freeman. Though he considered himself to be untouchable, what Morgan Freeman was about to say would silence the entire audience for the lobby speech. Like every Monday morning rush inside the Manhattan skyscraper, this one was ordinary. Workers rushed across the great lobby, their eyes fixed on their phones, their minds already racing with emails waiting in their inboxes, meetings, and deadlines. Business leaders, lawyers, and financial analysts moved deliberately. Their polished shoes clicked against the immaculate marble floor. The lobby was only a stop before rising to the high-rise offices where the actual work took place, for them. For Daniel, the janitor, this comprised his whole workstation. Every morning before the first wave of professionals arrived, he scrubbed the floors, wiped down the glass panels, polished the elevator buttons, and ensured that everything looked just as flawless as the people who worked there. He never expected praise. Though not glamorous, he took great satisfaction in his work. And yet, this morning would be different. Someone would make extra effort this morning to remind him of exactly where he stood in the hierarchy of this building. Just finishing mopping the last bit of the entrance floor, Daniel was gently working around the foot traffic as best he could. He didn't mind that most people ignored him. That would be his preferred arrangement. It simplified the work. Then, though, a sharp voice pierced the morning buzz. "Hey, you missed a spot." Daniel spun and blinked in astonishment. Standing near the security desk was Mark, the head of security. Tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a pristine uniform, Mark looked like he belonged in a corporate job rather than guarding a lobby. And from the way he carried himself, he seemed to believe that too. Daniel nodded courteously. He was used to being called out over little things. Rushing his mop, he said, "I'll get it in a second." But Mark neglected it. He went forward, his black boots polished, clicking against the tile. "You know," he said, his voice loud enough for several surrounding staff members to hear, "I don't get how people like you mess up the easiest jobs." Daniel hardened. A few workers stopped mid-stride, obviously listening but pretending not to hear, while an elderly man near the elevator sighed and shook his head as if saying, "Not again." A young woman in a blazer looked at Daniel with sympathy. Daniel had worked in this building long enough to have heard Mark had a reputation. He loved throwing his weight around, picking at the lower staff, behaving as though his uniform gave him more power than it really did. But he sounded louder than usual today. He aimed for an audience today. Daniel let out a slow breath. He had long ago discovered not to react. It did nothing except exacerbate things. "I'll take care of it," he said, then moving to once more clean the area. But Mark still had unfinished business. He snorted and crossed his arms. "You just mop floorings, man. How hard can it be? No wonder you're still mired in this after all these years." The words dropped like a slap. Although Daniel had experienced a lot of insults in his life, there was something about this one, the way it was expressed, that struck more than usual. The arrogance in it. And the worst aspect is still here. Nobody remarked. The front desk agent continued to type. Presuming they were not hearing a man being humiliated right in front of them, the staff members waiting for the elevator stared straight ahead. It served as a stinging reminder. People only cared when one of their own were mistreated. And those who clean. Their reality did not include janitors. A voice as deep as thunder rolled across the space just then. "That's an interesting thing to say." The air turned. Workers who had been about to enter the lifts stopped mid-motion. Mark's arrogant attitude wavered even as he turned toward the voice. And there, book in hand, Morgan Freeman was sitting sloppily in a leather chair next to the window. Nobody moved for a brief instant. Though Morgan Freeman was among the most identifiable people on the planet, he had been silently listening, watching the entire time. Now everyone turned to look at him. Suddenly conscious that the balance of power had changed, Mark cleared his throat and forced a grin. Rising straight as if posture could eliminate the last 30 seconds, he said, "Oh, Mr. Freeman, I didn't see you there." Morgan failed to match the grin. Rather, he closed his book, laid it on his lap, and stared at Mark the way a father views a child who just made a horrible mistake. "You said something interesting just now," he said, his voice cool but weighted. "You said, 'people like you.'" Mark moved awkwardly. "I just meant—" Morgan silently held up a hand. He said, pointing about the lobby, "Let me ask you something. Who do you suppose keeps this building standing?" Blinking Mark well, the executives, the company owners, the— "Wrong answer," Morgan said without pause. Around them, the staff members cast sidelong looks. Mark wrinkled his nose. "Sir, I don't think—" "No," Morgan said, slanted forward, his presence startlingly strong. "You not think. That's the problem." Mark said nothing, but his face turned red. Looking like he wanted to vanish, Morgan turned to Daniel, who had stayed silent and still carried his mop. "Son, how long have you worked here?" Morgan asked. Daniel stammered, then said, 13 years, Morgan nodding. "And in those 13 years, how often has this building been closed because it was too dirty to operate?" Daniel nodded. "Never," he answered. Morgan grinned, then turned back toward Mark. "Now tell me," he said, his voice lowering to give every syllable weight, "what happens if the janitors stop showing up?" Mark skipped the reply. As he knew, all knew, the immaculate flooring would not remain that way. The bathrooms smelled not quite new. The garbage cans would spill out. The conference rooms, the offices, the whole structure would not work. Not absent of people like Daniel. Morgan leaned back and saw Mark's look change from arrogance to something else, something like shame. "Funny how that works, isn't it?" Morgan said. A whisper of agreement swept through the lobby staff. The receptionist, who had acted as too busy to pay attention, nodded slightly. Mark looked down, his confidence broken. Morgan let the silence hang before delivering the last strike. "Respect is not about what you do for a living," he said. "It's about how you treat the folks who simplify your life without you even noticing." Mark choked hard, staring at Daniel. He first noticed the janitor as a man deserving of respect rather than as an invisible background element. Mark considered the lesson to be over, but what Morgan Freeman did next would leave everyone in that lobby stunned. Thicker than the polished marble flooring underfoot, a heavy silence covered the lobby. That morning, Mark answered no for the first time. Moments ago, he had been so sure of himself, so sure he was in charge of Daniel, so sure his words were reasonable. But today, he was not so certain now. Not only between Morgan Freeman and Mark, but over all those in attendance, his words hung in the air. Once apathetic workers now stood still, their curiosity turning into quiet contemplation. It went beyond simply Mark now. It was about all of them, about how readily they had let things like this slide go. And they saw it for the first time as it truly was. Mark turned on his feet and looked about as though he were trying to recover his dignity. "Sir, I never meant any harm," he said at last, but his voice lacked the usual conceit. Morgan nodded after a slow inhale. "Oh, I doubt you intended damage, son," he said, "but that means harm wasn't absent." Mark dropped down to really feel the weight of those words. Turning to Daniel, Morgan looked at once more as if the response had somehow changed. "Son, how long have you worked here?" he asked. 13 years, Daniel said once more. Morgan gave a small smile. 13 years, he answered. "That's a long time to be invisible." A small number of heads turned. Daniel answered slowly, rather right away. He was unsure of how to. As it was true, over a 10-year career, very few people had ever given him any more than a cursory nod or a whispered thanks in the hallways. He did not particularly expect a procession for his efforts. Still, sometimes, just sometimes, it would have been great to be treated more than background noise. Morgan let his words sink before he carried on. Turning back to the security guard. "Tell me something, Mark," he said. "What do you do when the break room looks messy?" Blinking, Mark stumbled. "Well, I hardly use the break room very often." Moore nodded. "Okay, but if you did and you walked in to find it filthy, trash overflowing, food left out, what would you do?" Mark stumbled. "I suppose I could call maintenance?" Morgan grinned and pointed at Daniel. "Exactly. And when the bathrooms aren't clean, and when the floor aren't spotless, and when the hallways start to smell like yesterday's lunch, who keeps this place from turning into chaos?" Mark sighed and worked at the back of his neck. "The janitors." "The janitors," Morgan said once more. He stepped forward, lowering his voice just enough to gather everyone in. "And yet you decided his work was beneath you when you saw this man today. This man who has been making sure you have a clean place to work for 13 years. Mark tightened his jaw but said nothing at all. Morgan inclined his head to examine him. "Tell me, Mark, would this building suffer if all the janitors vanished for just 1 week?" Mark let out a slow breath. "It would fall apart," Morgan asked an eyebrow. "And still, you don't see him as essential?" The stillness in the room got weightier. Eventually, Daniel spoke. Quietly, he said, "I don't need recognition. I merely want to be treated with dignity." Morgan grinned. "And that, my friend, is the only thing any of us truly want." He turned back to face Mark. "You see, son, power comes from how you treat the people who don't have to be nice to you. It comes from not what's on your uniform or from how many people answer to you." Mark gave a hard swallow. Morgan let the words settle, then added, "Because one day you could find yourself needing someone like Daniel more than you ever thought possible." The lobby started to hum with agreement. The truth in Morgan's words could not be refuted, even those who had tried to overlook the confrontation. A small number of staff members looked at Daniel and nodded politely. Others appeared to be reviewing their treatment of the other janitors in the building as well as him. One mid-level manager who had passed Daniel 1,000 times without ever making eye contact stepped forward warily. "Daniel, she said, pausing somewhat ashamedly. "Thanks. I never really thought about how much work you do around here." Startled, Daniel blinks. She was not the only one. A man in a suit cleared his voice uneasily. "Yeah, same here. I guess I take it for granted, but you help me to keep this place absolutely clean." Daniel felt seen for the first time in a very long period. Not as a backdrop character either. Not as a worker devoid of face. Personally, as well as in regards to... Still stiffly standing, Mark gazed down at the polished floor. When he turned back up at last, his look had changed from irritation to something else, something like understanding. Admitting he was out of line, he said, "I should not have spoken to you like that." Daniel nodded after a brief study of him. "We all have bad days," he said rather succinctly. "Try to do better next time." Morgan laughed. "That's the spirit." The silently observing receptionist stood up as the tension started to relax. "You know, we ought to address this." Morgan looked up an eyebrow. "What would you like to do?" She hesitated just a moment before speaking. "A recognition program for the janitorial staff. They've been keeping this building running for years, and we hardly honor them." The staff started to whisper agreement. One of the managers said, "That's actually a great idea." Another said, "Yeah. Why not for maintenance and support staff? We have employee awards for sales and leadership." Daniel appeared startled. When he showed up for work that morning, he had not expected this. Morgan chuckled. "Now that," he remarked, "is what real leadership looks like." Mark nodded, then let out a breath. "Count me in," he asked. Daniel grinned and shook his head incredulously. "Well," he said, "guess today wasn't so bad after all." Morgan's laughed. "Learning to treat each other a little better makes every day great." Just moments ago, the lobby had felt so tense. Now it was bursting with something else entirely. A sense of awareness, of change, of something better than before. Once more, picking up his mop, Daniel was not invisible. And that made all the difference, first of all in 13 years. The regular rush of staff members poured into the lobby of the tall Manhattan skyscraper the next morning. The same polished shoes tapped against the marble floor, the same hurried glances passed between colleagues, and the same daily ritual played out. But there was something different. Head of security, Mark stood by his post close to the door, but he was not the same man he had been standing there the morning before. He had spent the whole night mentally revisiting the events, his words, his tone, the arrogance he had expressed. More than that, he recalled the quiet, the manner in which none had defended Daniel, the way he had let his own sense of superiority fool him to the dignity of another human being. He had been quite certain that his work brought value, but now he realized that respect defines actual importance rather than power. Mark saw Daniel cleaning close to the elevators as staff members passed the lobby. He saw him not as only the janitor for the first time. He considered him as a man who had spent 13 years of his life ensuring the smooth running of this place. And Mark had denigrated that without thinking twice. Swallowing his pride, he moved over. Looking up, Daniel seemed a little startled. Mark stopped just a moment to cough. "Morning, Daniel," he murmured. Daniel blinked. Mark had never before personally addressed him by name in 13 years. "Morning," Daniel answered gingerly. Mark sighed and started to stand. "I was misdirected yesterday," he said. "I shouldn't have spoken to you like that. I didn't see things clearly." Daniel watched him for a moment before nodding. "We all make mistakes," he said, quite straightforwardly. "What counts is what you do following." Mark exhaled, then reached for his hand. "I wish I could do better." Daniel looked at the offered handshake and then grabbed it. Then that's a decent starting point. A few workers walking by stopped to see, some grinning to themselves. Something had changed. It transcended Mark and Daniel now. It concerned everyone in that building learning to perceive the people around them differently. An email addressed to every staff member that afternoon included, "Starting this month, we will be implementing an employee recognition program to highlight the hard work and dedication of all staff, including our maintenance and security teams. Their contributions are what keep this building running. It's time we acknowledge that." Daniel looked at the email incredulately. 13 years. 13 years of background, invisible, underappreciated employment. And right now, people began to see him now. The day before, Morgan Freeman had said something Daniel still found resonant. "True power comes from how you treat the people who do things for you, not from what you do." Ultimately, that was the lesson Mark and everyone else would never forget. This narrative helps us to understand that respect is acquired by kindness, humility, and the way we treat others. It is not given depending on income, status, or job titles. Daniel never sought acknowledgement. All he wanted was dignity and treatment. Mark thought authority defined power, but by the end of the narrative, he discovered that real power comes from the respect you treat of people around you. Through this story, we realize that we sometimes forget in our daily life the people who simplify our life, the drivers, the servers, the security guards, the cleaners. But the world would not run without them. More about our character than our success will ever say is revealed by the way we treat them. Respect is what makes you really valuable, even though at the end a title might define you.